Welcome to World of Soundtracks, a podcast where we explore storytelling aspects in films and TV through music. Whether it is comparing book adaptations, observing themes over a series, or microanalyzing the choice of instruments, we look at how the story is told and moves us. I'm your host, Ruth Mudge, and today we will be looking at the last of 3 adaptations of Persuasion, the 2022 Netflix movie featuring Dakota Johnson. In this episode, we are looking at the most recent Persuasion film on Netflix that came out in 2022, directed by Carrie Cracknell and the music by Stuart Earl. This is the first film for Carrie, as she has mostly directed theater in the UK. Stuart has written music for 4 different productions Carrie has done in England, featuring actors such as Jake Gyllenhaal and Hattie Manahan, who played Eleanor in the miniseries of Sense and Sensibility. Like many of the other British composers who wrote for Austen adaptations, he has been very involved with both music for theater and British TV, including the miniseries of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, with Aidan Turner from 2015, which won him an Ivor Novello Award, which is a British Songwriting and Composer Award. He also wrote episodes of Black Mirror and the miniseries of Little Women from 2018. His first film was In Our Name in 2010. Since Stuart had worked with Carrie before, it makes sense that she would bring him along on this project, especially since this is her first big production on this scale. That seems to be very common with directors to choose people on their team that they know and trust. In fact, that happened with Patrick Doyle and Kenneth Branagh moving from theater to films. It is interesting to note that all 3 composers for Persuasion were rooted in theater. This film fits more into the genre of rom-coms, fitting more with Emma than perhaps some of the other Persuasion films. It took a contemporary language into the Regency era, as well as colorblind casting, and combined it with a larger plot of Persuasion. Like the 2008 version, Anne is connecting to the audience, looking into the camera and breaking the 4th wall. Unlike the 2008, she speaks directly to the audience instead of her diary. This way, she can keep a lot of the comedy of Jane Austen's wit, especially in regards to the Elliots, while still letting the audience know what she thinks and feels. I've mentioned it in the other podcasts regarding Persuasion, but adapting Persuasion is a challenge. While Anne is not humorous in the book, Jane Austen has quite a few witty and biting things written about Anne's family, so this version transfers that sentiment over to Anne herself. This is similar to the movie of Mansfield Park, where they put Austen's juvenilia writing into Fanny's voice, as well as having her address the camera, again breaking the 4th wall. Here, Anne is the narrator and telling everyone everything from her point of view. While it may not match the character in the book in regards to her empathy and kindness, since they choose to tell instead of show, the film does cover the ridiculousness of her relatives, especially Sir Walter and Mary, which the pizzicato helps to accentuate with the occasional bells and flute. On the flip side, the other adaptations match more of the main characters and their journey, but it is more serious and lacks the wit and humor of Austen's writing. Each one decides to focus on a specific aspect of the story, and in this case they choose to focus on the humor, as well as the second chance of love with pining romantic leads often just missing each other. Before we move on to the music, I will say one thing. When I first started speaking about Austen soundtracks a few years ago, this movie had yet to come out but was in production. I remember clearly stating that I was quite excited to see this new Persuasion. While I love the other movies, I had been longing for sweeping romantic melodies that matched my interpretation of my favorite book that I didn't get from the other films. In some ways, I got my wish. I got the sweeping romantic melodies and themes for different characters. On the flip side, I was deeply disappointed on how my favorite couple in Austen literature did not resemble the characters from the book in personality or deep character. It was, ironically, a flip of the 1995 movie, which was true to the book, but I didn't care for the music. I have enjoyed it more as a romantic comedy in future viewings, outside of a few moments, as long as my book side doesn't take over. I also met someone outside of the Jane Austen circle, where many people have very strong opinions about this film. We were talking at a jazz concert, and she mentioned that she loved the film, which made her interested in reading the book. At the end of the day, that's all we want. We want the film to make someone fall in love with Austen and her works. On to the music itself. One of the aspects that connects this film with the other two is the focus on piano with an accompaniment of mostly strings, keeping the tradition of Anne's instrument being the main feature. It is also quite common for many rom-coms to heavily feature piano, as it is often used for more intimate, quiet scenes between the main couple. So it works for both counts in matching for Persuasion and the rom-coms. While there is the occasional flute, bells, or higher electronics, piano and strings are the main feature and way of telling the story throughout. However, the piano style and genre does change depending on who the focus is on. The other main addition is the harp. This addition matches many of the other Austen adaptations that use both piano and harp. In fact, there are very few that only have one or the other. Stuart wrote the music for the dancing scene at Uppercross ahead of time, so they could choreograph it, while the music played by Elizabeth Elliot in the Beth concert are classical pieces, straddling the line between the previous two adaptations of using classical music and original music by the composer for diegetic music, or music heard within the character's world. While classical music is heard during concerts, the rest of the music is modern and not trying to emulate the 1800s in style. The most memorable moments musically are the two sweeping melodies for Anne and Frederick's relationship that are reminiscent of Downton Abbey, Mr. Malcolm's List, or even Bridgerton. The main romantic theme, Clifftop Prelude, begins the film, as Anne narrates that she almost got married once, but was persuaded to refuse him. This version begins showing Anne and Captain Wentworth together during this time of engagement, kissing and cuddling on the cliff, the only time to show the couple before the present day. The piano is introduced with broken chords or arpeggios before moving into the main melody, both romantic and also a bit melancholy with the low strings and harmony. The violins join in higher near the end, something often done for a romantic theme to add a feeling of floating and soaring, as Anne and Captain Wentworth are shown to be happy together before she gave him up. This theme is also in a compound meter, which is a feeling of 3, that gives a sense of dancing and motion. This theme returns a few times in the movie, often truncated instead of the full melody. The opening chords in the piano are heard as Anne prepares to see Captain Wentworth for dinner, with Louisa helping her get ready. It reflects the mental preparation of seeing him for the first time, with all the feelings coming back as she speaks about him, remembering one of the things she loved about him at being a good listener, and yet needing to repress her true feelings in front of Louisa. This main theme returns in high synthesizers instead of strings, and in the higher piano range, when Anne and Captain Wentworth talk in Lime. Frederick mentions that he would like to be friends again, while Anne reluctantly agrees, even though she clearly feels differently since she still loves him. In fact, in this version, it is pretty clear that they both have feelings for each other and are a little depressed in agreeing to be friends. They refer to knowing each other well from the past, wanting to return and yet clearly still having barriers from their broken engagement. The music is almost dreamlike, turning the rhythm from being in 3 and making all the melody notes equal and slow in 2, lacking the movement of the piano and strings underneath. There's a stillness to it as they are almost tiptoeing around each other, trying to keep each other in their lives, but very cautious to share their true feelings. Using electronics and synthesizers is something Martin Phipps also did for more dreamlike feelings in his Austen adaptations of Persuasion and Sense and Sensibility. This main theme finally returns near the end in harp and synthesizers as they talk in Bath after the concert, calming and focusing just on the two of them as he refers to the past with Anne not being a card player, and Anne responding, "I have not changed so much." The music is again simplified instead of sweeping, as they look at each other, bringing a stillness even with the bustle happening all around them. This version also adds a harp, which provides a romantic element to this moment amidst all of this stillness. It is also another example of hinting at the past while simultaneously loving each other, but unable to communicate that, especially since Captain Wentworth believes she will marry Mr. Elliot. The other theme for the main couple occurs as Anne talks about her imaginings versus reality with Captain Wentworth. The first is in the journey to Uppercross, as she is suddenly confronted with the idea that she will see him again after many years, throwing back the idea that he probably hasn't forgiven her, but then throws out the what if. What if he has been pining for her, just the way she has been for him all these years, knowing that he hasn't married? The music, which began with harp as she travels in the coach, switches to another sweeping violin theme as she says this possibility of hope. Like the first theme, it is both romantic with hope, but also a tinge of melancholy and wistfulness, alternating between minor and major in the chords. This theme returns when Captain Wentworth helps Anne into the carriage after she hurts her ankle. The theme is heard in the piano and over high synthesizers, again providing a slightly dreamlike scenario as she is almost overwhelmed by it. It is also truncated and in 2 instead of 3, evening out the rhythm, making it less like a waltz or a dance in the same way that the previous melody did during their interactions. It gives hints of how he used to care, while still emphasizing their distance, as well as her feeling slightly embarrassed about the whole situation. Things are not as they used to be, so even changing the rhythm matches how they are no longer in sync. This theme returns with the piano and underlying strings, making it more intimate as Anne hears the news of Louise's engagement near the end from Lady Russell, assuming that she's engaged to Captain Wentworth, followed by crying in the bathtub, imagining that she would handle this moment with grace, expecting it and yet still heartbroken when the event had finally come. It is another moment where Anne is dealing with what she had imagined versus the reality in her heartbreak and pining. The other main theme that returns is one used for transitions. This is very common in many Austen adaptations, to have the music accompany the switch of locations, or new characters, or as they walk and travel. In this case, it is often switching to new places. This theme has female voices, harp, bells, and strings. It is charming music, and in 3, like many of the other pieces, feeling like a waltz. This is first heard as Anne is left alone at Kellynch Hall, after receiving many instructions from her father and sister, one of them being not to go into the shrubberies with a tenant, and then transitioning to Anne showing the shrubberies to the Crofts. This plays again when Anne goes to Uppercross for dinner, when she finally sees Frederick for the first time in years with a different violin theme playing, which is similar to the Pining theme, but a happier major as everyone enters the dining room. She, however, tries to avoid sitting next to Captain Wentworth while Louisa tries to set them up. The music reflects the beauty of the lanterns, which is why it's called Lanterns, the happiness of everyone around here, and the overall joy of the majority of the characters. The theme Lanterns continues as Anne walks behind Louisa and Captain Wentworth, watching Louisa pursue him after sharing her interest in him to Anne, talking about ships in an interested, slightly flirtatious way. Not only is it a theme of transition, but it is one of movement, not only as they walk, but seemingly seeing Frederick literally move on with Louisa. The music returns as they transition to Lyme, looking over the sea and meeting Captain Harville, who knows who Anne has been to Captain Wentworth over the years. The final transition moment is near the end, as all the Musgroves, Captain Harville, and Anne joyfully reunite at the inn in Bath, also seeing Frederick there as well. Sadly, the humorous music, especially in regards to the Elliot family, is not included on the soundtrack. Much of that is in pizzicato or plucked strings, frequently for humor and giving space for the dialogue, or in this case, the narration by Anne. The introduction to Sir Walter is quite funny, and a little jazzy between the chords, bass pizzicato, and the brushes on the snare drum. While I don't have a snare drum, this can give you a sense of what that music sounds like. This occurs as Anne describes Sir Walter as he stares at himself in the mirror. When he describes himself, the violins make it more classical with arpeggios, but using the same chords. It shows the humor of how Anne sees him versus how he sees himself, with more class than he might actually possess. In a similar way, the music for Mr. Elliot is also not included on the soundtrack, combining some of the pizzicato humor with a jazzy style of piano, immediately telling you from the get-go that this man is very aware of himself, full of swagger and charm. It is quite humorous, but also matches his bravado as he flirts with Anne, while informing her that he is there to stop Mrs. Clay. Although I will say the twist of them getting married was not one I was expecting. He clearly lies to Frederick later on after the concert about getting married to Anne, causing trouble in a different way. His music immediately appears once he does on the cliffs, telling you that he is both trouble and the suave villain. Let's just say that the music is not very subtle. The piano music accompanying the famous letter near the end is the most similar to Martin Phipps's music in the 2008 movie, being more atmospheric, beginning with high electronics that stay on the same notes for a long time, while the arpeggiated piano changes with chords very similar to the chords for Anne's opening melody. This allows room for feeling the emotions swirling, but also leaves room for the beautiful and iconic words as Anne reads them to the audience. As the piece grows, the lower piano octaves add gravity in the same way that Phipps had grown his music as well. Here is the letter. The other moment that is similar with layers and atmospheric in nature is when Anne decides to wade into the sea in lime and float in the water, enjoying freedom and seeking to deal with her emotions in the sea after talking to Frederick saying he wanted to be friends again halfway through the story. The harp is the moving instrument with the slowly changing but related chords, with underlying strings and synthesizers matching the ebb and flow of the sea, especially with the lower strings in the second half, while the piano plays a melody in the higher register. This melody also undulates going up and down, matching the sea, in Anne's churning feelings as she seeks peace floating in the sea. This movie probably has one of the biggest range of styles throughout, while staying within a mostly modern classical range in regards to instruments at least, while still expanding out to minimalism and jazz influences. While Northanger Abbey from the 80s might be the one that pushes the boundaries the most, this one is probably the one that's staying the closest to modern music. That being said, there are two examples of classical music being performed in this movie, like many Austen adaptations, and one pop song, which is more unusual. The first of the classical pieces is a piano arrangement of the Dance of the Blessed Spirits from Gluck's opera Orfeo ed Eurydice, written in 1762, although technically the dance was one of several dances added to the revision of the opera in 1774. The French really love to have ballet in their operas. While originally for flute and strings, it was quite common in the day of Austen, as it is now, to have piano arrangements of favorite operas or pieces for other instruments. In this case, Elizabeth Elliot is trying to show off her talents on the piano in the background, while Mr. Elliot talks to Anne instead. Here is the original version for flute and strings. And a dramatic contrast is the classical song at the concert in Bath, Alto Giove, from the opera Polifemo by Nicola Porpora from 1735, sung in this movie by the wonderful Marta Fontanals-Simmons. Like Gluck's opera, this is also based on Greek mythology, where a mortal has been restored to life by Jove, to the joy of his love, the nymph Galatea. This is often sung by male altos, or back when it was written, castrati, but here it is sung by a female mezzo-soprano. The piece is in minor and quite dramatic. Anne is clearly moved by hearing the song in Italian, almost to the point of tears, whether by the beauty of the music or the words, and it continues in the background as Captain Wentworth leaves, jealous of Mr. Elliot, as she tries to convince him to stay, and then as Mr. Elliot interrupts and then proposes. a completely different vein, the climax of the movie is accompanied by a pop song. This is pretty common in modern rom-coms, but less common in Jane Austen adaptations. In fact, the only one to have a modern-style song was Northanger Abbey in the 80s, which is an experience unto itself. This song was written by the artist Birdy, working with Stuart to match the style and feel of his music, and the words were clearly written for Anne's story. Birdy is a young British singer in her 20s who already has 5 albums, the first one debuting in 2011. She won a talent contest in the UK at the age of 12, which propelled her into the national music sphere. Her songs have appeared in several different films, including Brave, The Fault in Our Stars, and The Hunger Games. I highly recommend reading the entire lyrics. Since it is rather long, I'm not going to read all of them, but she does capture the essence of this particular adaptation with the following lyrics. Quietly keeping this hope in my heart, prayed the night bring back what I lost. Many years have gone by, but I never forgot. I've always been yours, only yours. There was a time when I let you go, allowed myself to be swayed and pulled. But for all my days I make a vow, no words would ever shake me now. Like the 2008 Persuasion, Anne runs through the streets of Bath after reading the letter, trying to catch Captain Wentworth before he joins his new ship in commission. The music begins with piano, electronics, and background strings, matching the style of the soundtrack even though having a singer is different. The phrase quietly yours is sung as they reunite, kiss, and then hold on to each other, finally together after missing each other for such a long time. There is a wedding following this, but instead of the main couple, it is Mr. Elliot and Mrs. Clay, with most of the other characters happy in their pews with their respective partners, before showing Anne and Frederick once more happy together on a cliff, clearly mirroring and bookending the opening of the movie with the same location, this time wearing wedding rings. I do love a good musical bookend, and while I didn't get that in this version, it was a very clear visual bookend.
White sails and offshore lights, we were passing ships in the night. Now I'm tracing shadows on your back, like I dreamt so many times. Oh, for so long I've been waiting, for so long for love like this. And I was so sure, baby, I lost you for a minute, but there's a sweetest spring at my door. Can you feel it? Just the same as before. Many years have gone by, but I knew you'd come. Quietly keeping this hope in my heart, breathing I breathe back what I lost. Many years have gone by, but I never forgot. I've always been yours, only yours.
While this style of song was more traditionally used in credits in movies from the 90s, like Ever After, or Disney movies, it has moved over time to be the accompaniment for the main love climax in rom-coms, combining words and music to reflect the feelings of the main couple. This also happens in serialized TV series over the past few decades, but has become very expected in movies, especially those on Netflix or Hallmark or things like that. We just aren't used to it being added to our Austen period dramas. This movie has its highs and its lows. The music is beautiful and does a great job to reflect the humor and the romantic comedy of a couple getting a second chance with sweeping melodies. Sometimes it lacks subtlety in telling the story, which at times is quite humorous and other times a bit over the top. In many ways, this movie is the extreme to the 1995 version, which was extremely restrained and lacking passion in its music choices. Whether you enjoy the movie for itself, or get bogged down by the unusual choices to a beloved novel and have trouble moving past those changes, the music on the soundtrack itself is lovely to listen to. This is the last Austen episode, as all the other adaptations lack a soundtrack to share. I'm currently figuring out which direction to go next, as there are so many great options to choose. In the meantime, you can join in on discussing all the musical moments regarding your favorite Persuasion in the Facebook group World of Soundtracks, or on Twitter and Instagram at WO Soundtracks. Please like and subscribe, share with friends, or even leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Amazon. I highly recommend subscribing so you don't miss when the next episode comes out, especially as it has been a little more sporadic. You can also reach out through my website, ruthmudge.com. A special thanks to Panzu from Australia, who sent me a lovely message about the podcast. Those messages and reviews do mean a lot to me, and reviews on Apple Podcasts, as you probably have heard a million times from other podcasts, do raise the awareness of this podcast to other listeners. I look forward to our next musical journey together. Until next time, happy listening. A special thanks to all those involved to make this podcast happen, especially Edith Mudge for the title music and Lindsay Bergsma for the graphics. This is World of Soundtracks.